Welcome to this tutorial, where we will explore cartoonish powerful clang effects, which are a key element in stylized fighting and action games. Our ultimate goal will be to create a procedural clang special effect in Unreal Engine, which can be used not only as a few frames effect, as in the reference, but also as an effect with longer duration and more frames to playback. We will be using material in Unreal for scaling and offsetting several prepared transparency textures so that by interfering with each other, they provide a sense of impact and clang from the hit being casted in the game. We have created empty files for the Niagara system and material. Also, let's create a file in Photoshop with the following structure. 5 folders for each alpha texture. In the first folder, a white rectangle with white glow and 1 black ellipse with black glow, which we will duplicate later. In the remaining 4 folders, place a white ellipse with white glow in each. Export the contents of each of the 5 folders with the following names. We will create a 3D model in Houdini that will be responsible for the downscaling of alpha textures placed on it. To do this, we will create a rectangle using the following nodes, add details to it for less bias of UV coordinates, set 0 mesh scale at the very beginning, and export it to the project. In the project, we will select the model in the file manager and press this button in the material editor to view the material directly on the model. Let's create the logic for texture blending. We'll send a constant with a value of 1 to the emission, create a slot for 1 texture, duplicate it 4 times, assign textures that are exported from Photoshop. In the alpha channel, we'll send the following bundle of sequential texture subtraction. Let's create UV coordinate processing. Add nodes for static and dynamic parameters. Write a name for the static parameter, link in a single chain. The nodes for sourcing UV coordinates, subtraction, multiplication, addition, and another addition. Add a node that forms a vector from 2 values, duplicate it, and connect all dynamic and static parameters into the stream. Everything should be arranged so that first the pivot offset is subtracted to the center, then the coordinates are multiplied by the scalar of static and dynamic UV parameters, then the coordinates are returned the offset to 0 from the center, then the coordinates are added the sums of static and dynamic parameters for y and v respectively. We will duplicate the processing of UV coordinates for all 4 textures that we plan to animate. Then we'll name all static parameters and set index for each dynamic parameter cluster. Assemble a Niagara system. In Properties, set local space and fixed bounds. In Emitter Update, add emitter state, set lifecycle mode, self, set kill, set duration fixed. Add spawn burst instantaneous, set check count limit. In particle spawn, set initialize particle and specify their lifetime mode, direct set and lifetime 1. Sprite size mode, uniform with size 10. In mesh scale mode, also set uniform and specify size as 5. In mesh renderer, specify a 3D model from Houdini. Enable override material, create an array element in override materials, and connect our material. Return to particle spawn and add initial mesh orientation and specify mode system. Check rotation and set their x equals minus 0.25 and set rotation coordinates local. Go to particle update, add particle state and uncheck kill there, add scale mesh size, add set parameters, add dynamic parameters. Enable all checkboxes for all 4 parameter clusters. Edit the first curve for scale and duplicate it to all scale parameters. Edit the third curve for offset and duplicate it to all offset parameters. Add system location. Go to the particle system settings and connect bindings to all vector parameters and set the value to 1 for all scale parameters. Tweak offset parameters. Make sure all 4 textures are working. Move away the last 3 of the animating textures to start working with the first one. First, we detail the base mask in Photoshop. To do this, we duplicate the ellipse many times and assemble the right edge from the copies, trying to avoid repetitiveness. Export. Now let's focus on designing textures that will later be animated. The first animated mask will be the largest among the alpha textures, and according to my idea, it will shift along a large part of the space according to UV coordinates. Add a main ellipse. Add a second ellipse and slightly rotate it so that together with the first ellipse, specifically on the left, they establish a larger rhythm. This is so that even when the UV coordinates are very reduced, the details still do not look small. Add fractal detail to the main detail on the left and below its middle. Also add several fractal details to the second main ellipse. On the right, this will be a small pointed detail, so that where the UV coordinates are either medium or large, there is additional detailing. On the left end, there will be two details. One will create a vertical fractal volume. The other will create a horizontal fractal volume, as we see. While intersecting, they have some volumes sagging in the corners. Such an approach to texture creation takes into account the features of our high-level setup, namely scale contrasts at the UV level, along with the strategy of forming dynamic transparency patterns that the first animated texture is planned to occupy the main visual dynamics, and the other animated textures will be subsequently arranged in layers of features that complete this dynamics. The second animated mask placed 3 ellipses in a stair-like fashion, the bottom one wide, the middle one slightly less wide, the top one much wider and significantly tilted, barely touching on the right to give a narrower readability rhythm there. The fourth ellipse is also to give a narrower rhythm of readability on the right end. It merges strongly with the lower ellipse, only differentiating the ellipses from each other on the left, and on the right they completely merge, forming a smoother shape. The remaining space on the left will simply be filled. The third animated mask. No fractal details here, just 3 ellipses in a stair-like fashion from left to right, from bottom to top, slightly thinning from the bottom to the top, adjacent to each other. The fourth animated mask, almost like the third, only the bottom ellipse is about 3 times thicker, and the top one is slightly longer and shifted more to the right. Let's move on to forming the first frame. Set the first texture. Scale it so that it takes up a lot of space, but can still take up even more space in the final frame. Try to move it towards the top edge so that, later on, when it enlarges and shifts slightly, this edge will beautifully dynamically seem to break its tension. Move the second texture into the visible field. Narrow it down so that it compensates for some of the vertical space left by the previous texture. Push it past the left edge, and scale it horizontally in such a way that it forms a kind of straight between itself and the previous texture. We will also control this straight as a dynamic entity. Try to give it a beautiful shape using texture interference, and also try to create a sense of tension break there. Move the third texture into the visible field. Compress it vertically and push it past the right edge, so that this texture claims to create another coast or straight, primarily with its interference with the first texture and secondarily even with the second texture. The tension between them can also be taken into account at a high level. Move the fourth texture into the visible field. Only slightly integrate it into the rhythm of the 0 alpha texture, with a focus on displaying it later on, with the aim of polishing the interference of all previous textures with its presence. Let's proceed to animation. We will edit keys in the last frame. First, we'll animate the scale parameter. We'll simply make a linear transition, as it will be in all our keys today. For the first texture in the last frame, we will initially set a small scale horizontally and compensate with a horizontal offset. We'll make it so that the beginning of the texture remains roughly in the same place on the left. Then we'll animate its vertical scale to create interesting interference with the stripe that is formed by our texture and the smooth upper edge. We will intuitively bring this interference closer to sensations, clumpiness of discharges, disintegration, as it moves away from the impact center. For the second texture, we will first do horizontal scaling and make sure that the horizontal offset is executed in as sufficient a form as possible. For our aesthetic requirements for the stripes, which pockmark the angular propagation of the impact to have high-intensity unidirectional distortions. We will also finalize this with vertical scaling and offset. make it so that in the last frame, the rows of interference break down into rhythms perpendicular to them. For the third texture, we will do almost the same thing as the second. Scale horizontally and finalize with a horizontal offset, and use vertical scale and vertical offset to also introduce in dynamic rows of interference the breakdown into rhythms perpendicular to them. With the fourth texture, we will stagger the rhythm of irregularities in the tail. We will try to influence every untouched detail and achieve authentic dissolution of clumps. Experimentally, we'll try to just comb through the remaining details while adhering to our aesthetic goals. That's it, the procedural Toon Clang and Impact effect is ready. All that's left is to add the muzzle texture for a few frames. I'll only show you its final version. I'm sure you can easily create it yourselves. Duplicate the system. The exported texture in the material is already prepared here, and I assign it to the Niagara system, then sequence this system with the one we've already made. I simply show a few frames of a static muzzle. If desired, you can enlarge it or even make two muzzles, but the main role of dynamics is played by the angular impact, and it looks quite good. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe, comment, go through my links and subscribe on other platforms. Bye.